If you have his word, and I hope you do, let me invite you to open with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Feel free to use table of contents if you need to find 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and let me invite you to pull out the worship guide that hopefully you received when you came in this morning. There's some notes in there that will guide our time together in this chapter. I have been looking forward to preaching this chapter ever since we started this series, and my study in it over the last couple of weeks has been nothing short of exhilarating and convicting and comforting and inspiring, just all wrapped up in one. This is one of the most famous chapters in all the Bible, the love chapter. It's often read at weddings, even at funerals. It's a chapter that I memorized and quoted to my, then girlfriend the night I asked her to marry me. And she said yes, so that would be Heather. But I don't think I realized at that point, I don't think most people realize the potency of this passage, because it's so oftentimes read outside of the context in which it was written. So it's sandwiched between Paul's instruction on spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and 1 Corinthians chapter 14, what we looked at the last couple of weeks with Pastor Jim, and what we're going to look at next week when it comes to prophecy and tongues. But this chapter, when it's understood in its context, has huge ramifications for understanding love in the midst of the church in light of spiritual gifts. And as I've prayed in preparation for this day, I've just prayed that God would make this kind of love a mark, if not the mark, not only in my own life, but of the church at Brook Hills, this local church. One writer said, it's clear that 1 Corinthians 13 must be studied in the context of the rest of Paul's letter to the church at Corinth. Otherwise, it remains mere words, noble, even ennobling, but only words. But when applied to a local church, this chapter becomes dynamite, for it uncovers all the weaknesses, gaps, failures, and sins in any Christian community. This chapter may be dynamite among us as a family of faith. Another writer said the full impact and depth of the truths here can't be discovered in isolation. Much of the power, even much of the purpose and beauty is missed when the passage is studied and applied outside of the local church. So here's what I want to do this morning, something a little unique. The last thing I want us to do as a local church is just to read and study and have a good lesson on love today. Instead, I really want us to internalize this text, to reflect on it, to evaluate each of our lives individually, but maybe even more importantly, our life together in light of it. And to pray together that God would make love, the kind of love we're about to look at, the mark of the church at Brook Hills. And so in order to encourage, challenge us in this way, I want us to actually together try to memorize part of this chapter with one another this morning. So I know of no better way to internalize, reflect, meditate on a passage of Scripture than to memorize it, to let its words literally fill our minds and our hearts. So that's what I want us to do this morning. We're gonna read the whole chapter. We're going to consider the context, and then we're going to dive in specifically to verses 4 through 7, and I want us to memorize that paragraph together in a way that I hope we walk away today as a faith family with these words imprinted, impressed upon our minds and our hearts, and collectively our life together. So you're going to have to do some work this morning. So if you thought you were just going to come and sit for a while, like, not possible. So we're going to involve some work, memorizing these 4 verses, and you're not going to be able to look down, so no cheating. We're going to see that love does not rejoice in wrong, and so no cheating. And so we're going to be looking up. We're going to help one another memorize these verses. But before we do that, let's start by just reading the whole chapter. We want to see this text in its context. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 1. The Bible says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I've been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these is love. Okay, let's start. Before we dive into those verses in the middle, verses 4 through 7, let's think about what's going on before and after this in light of what was going on in the church at Corinth. So here's a people, we know from the last couple of weeks in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, what we're going to see next week in 1 Corinthians 14, they were gifted spiritually. And many of them saw their gifts as a sign of their spirituality. But amidst all of their focus on spiritual gifts, particularly sensational gifts like prophecy or speaking in tongues, which Paul's going to address specifically in the next chapter, they were losing sight of what was most important. It's interesting. You look at verses 4 through 7, what we're going to look at or memorize together in just a second, you'll realize that this is not just some random list of characteristics of love. This is specifically a rebuke of lack of love in the church at Corinth. You think about what we've learned already about this church. This church was filled with brothers and sisters who were impatient and unkind toward each other, not even sharing food with one another in the Lord's Supper. They were filled with jealousy for one another. They're puffed up, proud. We saw that in the first few chapters of 1 Corinthians. Rejoicing in evil, 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Taking each other to court, 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Insisting on their own way, even if it caused others to stumble, 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Acting, even dressing and praying in ways that were rude and offensive and shameful, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Competing over who was the most spiritually gifted, 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And so Paul pauses at this point in this letter and sums up in a sense the whole letter by saying, you guys are missing the point. Now specifically here when it comes to spiritual gifts. And so follow this. 1 Corinthians 13 was written down at a particular point in history, at a particular point in this letter, to make clear that spiritual gifts, so follow this in your notes, spiritual gifts are significant, but love is supreme. So Paul immediately starts this chapter by addressing the gifts that they were prone to boast in. Speaking in tongues, which they thought virtually equated them with angels speaking the words of heaven. Prophetic powers, gifts of knowledge and faith that moves mountains, even great sacrifice of their possessions, their lives. And Paul says, none of that matters apart from love. None of it. So follow with me here. This is huge. Love is the necessity apart from which nothing in the Christian life matters. Nothing in the Christian life matters apart from love. Nothing. If I speak with the tongues of angels but don't have love, I'm just an annoying noise. If I know and speak all the mysteries of heaven, if I have faith that can move mountains, but I don't have love, listen to the end of verse 2. It's not just that these gifts of faith and prophecy are nothing. Paul says, I am nothing. This is a shattering conclusion. The Bible's not just saying here that apart from love, spiritual gifts are worthless. The Bible's saying that apart from love, I am worthless. I am nothing apart from love, Paul says. And I gain nothing, verse 3. Even if I give away everything I have to the poor, even if I sacrifice my life, if I do that without love, it's worth nothing. Martyrdom itself is meaningless apart from love. So you take this text and apply it to things that we might value in our day, in our church, and realize the implications. I mean, for me, if I preach God's love with power and zeal, but have not love, it's worth nothing. I'm just making noise. If we together have Bible knowledge and theological training in disciple making, but have not love, it's worthless. If we do small groups, if we gather together in settings like this to worship, or gather together to pray, but we have not love, none of it means anything. If we are radical in our giving and our going, if we do foster care and adoption, if we're involved in ministry all across the city, if we go on mission trips around the world, but we don't have love, we miss the entire point. Love is the necessity apart from which nothing, no one matters at all. Do you see what the Bible's saying here? We are, I am, the church of Brook Hills is nothing. No matter what we do, we are nothing apart from love. Now, it's not that these things aren't good things, giving, going, serving, preaching, all these different things that we think about in this church or think about in the church at Corinth. These are good things. Spiritual gifts, significant when they are done in the context of love. And that's the key. Spiritual gifts are given as an expression of love in the church. So keep going your notes here. Yes, love is the necessity apart from which nothing in the Christian life matters. At the same time, love is the field in which everything in the Christian life flourishes. When these gifts are exercised in love, expressed in love, there's power and potency in these gifts in the church. So this is not Paul saying, don't worry about gifts, don't worry about giving, don't worry about faith. This is Paul saying, use your gifts, give sacrificially of your possessions, your lives, have faith, all in the context of love. You'll notice that right after this chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 1, Paul picks up and he says, pursue love. Pursue love. And in that context, earnestly desire the spiritual gifts. Which is interesting. You go back to the verse right before 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 31. At the end of that chapter on spiritual gifts, Paul says, now I will still show you in a more excellent way. Translation, I want to pause and remind you that there's something out here that's not just a select spiritual gift, but there's an entire way of life in which these gifts are to be expressed. Love is the field in which everything in the Christian life flourishes. Spiritual gifts significant, but love is supreme. Then he goes on, that's the first part of 1 Corinthians 13. He goes on in the last part of 1 Corinthians 13 to show that spiritual gifts are temporal, but love is eternal. That's what verses 8 through 13 are all about. For a people who thought they had spiritually arrived because they were speaking the language of heaven, tongues of angels, Paul says, well, I've got news for you. We're not going to be speaking in tongues in heaven, or prophesying for that matter, or filling each other in on new revelation. No, these spiritual gifts are given to the church for a specific period of time, but when we are with God in a new heaven and a new earth, we won't need these gifts anymore. When the perfect comes, the Bible says the partial will pass away. And there's two illustrations here, one of a child growing into adulthood and one of looking in a mirror as opposed to looking face to face. And the purpose of both illustrations is to show that spiritual gifts are temporary. It's not to say that spiritual gifts are childish. You speak in tongues, well, that's childish, that's immature, inappropriate. These gifts are actually very appropriate at a certain time. So my youngest son has just started crawling. And it is the cutest thing in the world to see him smiling as he scoots around the floor. We laugh, we're watching, we're videoing him, taking pictures, all of this stuff. That is totally appropriate for a 9-month-old. But if he's doing the same thing when he's 29 years old, that's not going to be cause for pulling out the video camera and laughing. And so that matters. There's a whole host of things he's doing at 9 months old that are not going to be appropriate at 29 years old. So Paul says to the church at Corinth, you think that you're fully mature because you're crawling. He says, no, this is just temporary. You've not reached adulthood because now you're a crawler. These gifts and their use in the church are going to fade away. Why? Second illustration, because now we see and we learn and we know and we speak about God indirectly. It's not that what we prophesy or pray or speak is untrue in any way. It's just incomplete. We're looking forward to the day when we will see Christ face to face. We will know him truly without any error or sin in us at all. And so these gifts in these ways will no longer be necessary. In this way, prophecies will pass away. Tongues will cease. But what will remain? Love will remain. It never ends. Spiritual gifts are temporal, temporary. So love is eternal. Spiritual gifts significant. Love is supreme. So then, what is the nature of love in the church? And And what Paul does in verses 4 through 7, so now we're starting to hone in on these verses that we're going to memorize together. What Paul does here is he doesn't give us as much of a definition of love as much as he gives us a description of love. And what I want to show you, even before we dive into the specifics, is just two general truths that characterize love as a whole. Because I want us to be careful. One writer said, studying 1 Corinthians 13 is like taking apart a flower. Part of the beauty is lost when the components are separated. So before we start plucking petals off this rose, so to speak, I want us to just make sure we see the rose as a whole. Before we carefully dissect every bit of it, let's see it all together. Two overall truths that we learn here about love. One, love is essentially selfless. It's essentially selfless. All the lovelessness at Corinth could be traced back to selfishness. You read through verses 4 through 7, you begin to realize that according to 1 Corinthians 13, the opposite of love is not really hate. The opposite of love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is actually pride. It's arrogance, it's boasting, it's seeking your own way. And so to love like this, you have to die to your pride. You have to die to yourself. You have to realize, we have to realize that within ourselves, we all have a sinful nature that prioritizes self. We don't like it when things don't go our way. We don't like it when people hurt us. We don't like it when people irritate us. And we do like it when people think well of us. We like it when people bring pleasure to us. In fact, that's oftentimes what motivates our love for them. Isn't that how we view love in this world in terms of warm feelings, desire, even romance? Many times when we say, I love you, what we really mean is, I love me and I want you. And our love for others is actually love for ourselves. But the kind of love that's described here is essentially selfless, meaning in its essence, it is selfless. It's patience when patience is not deserved. It's kind when kindness is hard. It doesn't envy or boast because it's not comparing you with me and trying to figure out how I stand in comparison to you. It doesn't insist on my way, but others' way. Now this doesn't mean, when the Bible says there in verse 5, it does not insist on its own way. It doesn't mean that love doesn't want to be happy. The difference is how love seeks its happiness. It's there in your notes. I think it sums up the selfless nature of love. Love seeks its joy in the good of others to the glory of God. This is so huge. Love does not say the secret to happiness is finding myself. Love says the secret to happiness, to joy, is dying to myself, laying down my life for the good of others to the glory of God. This is exactly what Paul's been saying ever since 1 Corinthians chapter 8, really since the beginning of the book. Love is essentially selfless. And then second, love is inevitably active. So it's interesting, the Bible doesn't use adjectives here to describe love as much as it uses verbs to describe love. The picture is love does this, love does that. Love doesn't do this, love doesn't do that. You have 15 verbs in verses 4 through 7 that describe present, continuous action. So this is not about words and ideas as much as this is about action and deeds. Love is not conveyed by words as much as it is shown by behavior. It's not that Paul's out to define love here. Paul's out to apply love here to the church at Corinth, for us to consider how love is applied in our lives. So that then leads us to the marks of love in the Christian. And I phrase that way in your notes because of the way Jesus spoke to his disciples in John 13:35. You remember what he said? By this will all men know that you're my disciples, if you do what? Audience participation part of our program. You're about to have to start memorizing, so come back in here, okay? By this will all men know that you're my disciples, if you love one another. So Jesus said, this is going to be the distinguishing mark of you as my disciples. What a powerful statement. The supreme mark of discipleship to Jesus in the world is love among his disciples. If you love one another. And so we need to then evaluate our lives, our relationships with one another according to these characteristics of love. We need to ask, are these characteristics evident in this church? Are these characteristics evident in your small group? Are these characteristics evident in your relationships with the people around you in the church at Brook Hills? In your relationship to the people called the church at Brook Hills? And then yes, to think through, are these characteristics evident in my home? In the way I love my spouse or my kids or my parents? Are these characteristics evident in my work, to the people that I work with? These characteristics evident to my neighbors, the people around me in this city, community, among the nations for that matter. So this is where we're going to start memorizing. And again, not just for the sake of memorization, but for the sake of internalization, reflection, meditation in a sense. We're going to walk through verses 4 through 7 and impress them on our minds. And as we do, consider them in our hearts and lives. So let's start with the first 3 words, okay? I'll start, you repeat after me so you can look up. It's only 3 words. You got this, I promise. Okay? So, love is patient. Love is patient. Love is patient. You're doing awesome. Okay, so in light of that, I ask you, are you patient with others? Are you patient with others? Are you patient with people in this church? Are you patient with people in your home? With the people at your work, say, that is a patient person. In your home, in the church, that is a patient person. And this word doesn't just mean to wait for others, but it literally means to endure injury from others without retaliation against them. So are you willing to be inconvenienced, offended, annoyed, even hurt by others over and over again without getting upset or angry? I think of so many people in my life who are patient with me. From my precious, patient wife, to my patient children, to the people that I work most closely with, to this church. You have been so patient with me. I don't know what you were thinking 7 years ago when you called this 27-year-old to pastor this church, but you have been very patient with me. Are you patient with others? Love is patient and kind. Say that with me. Love is patient and kind. One more time. Love is patient and kind. So are you kind to others? This is not just passive endurance of others. This is active goodness toward others. Do you actively work for the welfare of others in the church? Did you come here today even thinking, not what can I get, but what can I give to the people around me in this gathering? Is that your posture of kindness, active, deliberate, intentional goodness toward others? When you go to a small group, are you going with the posture of, not what can I give, what can I give? How can I be poured out for others in kindness toward others? Is this the way you walk into your home? Is this the way you look at your spouse, your children, your parents? Is this the way you walk into your workplace? With active goodness toward others. Love is kind